So a few weeks ago, there was a lengthy piece in the Sunday New York Times entitled, "Why is the Loneliness Epidemic So Hard to Cure?" Perhaps you've heard this phrase, loneliness epidemic. The Surgeon General, about a year or two ago, issued a warning about an epidemic of loneliness. There are numerous studies that talk about how people are experiencing deep and painful loneliness, a deep sense of isolation at greater levels than we've ever known before. And what's more, there are studies that actually say that this is not just something that makes people miserable, but actually really harms health. It raises blood pressure, makes type 2 diabetes more likely, impairs cognitive function, and shortens the span of people's lives. So it is in real sense an epidemic. But this essay was less talking about the fact that we have a problem and more trying to say, so what do we do about it? And it charted different efforts that not just the United States, because this is actually a global problem that countries throughout have been trying to do to address this issue of this incredible rise in loneliness. So there are campaigns that people are doing, advertising, encouraging people to do hobbies. In the United Kingdom, apparently, they are training mail carriers to check in on people occasionally to make sure that they're still okay. The Surgeon General of the United States have encouraged Hollywood with their TV shows and movies to try to present social connection as more desirable, to kind of teach people. I don't know about you, I'm not terribly optimistic that any of those is going to suddenly stop having people be lonely as a result. In this essay, it also spoke of this really large study that the Harvard Graduate School of Education did, where not only did they try to understand why people are feeling lonely, but they even tried presenting some recommendations for how to fix this. And the recommendations were probably what you would imagine a Harvard Graduate School of Education would be. First, and this is my paraphrase, but I think this is fair, of the three recommendations, the first one is to educate those who are lonely, to help them figure out how not to be lonely. Number two, to educate institutions like schools to help people connect to each other. Number three, actually, I thought was the one that was especially interesting to me. It was restore our commitments. It spoke fairly bluntly about what it seemed like a great moral failure of our country, speaking of how parents are now training kids to seek happiness and achievement, but there's just no emphasis on caring for one another. And it's like, we're needing to change in that. So how do we do that? Education. Again, like it seems like the answer again and again is, how do we fix loneliness? Let's teach people. And is that really the best we can do? Is that actually going to make a difference and move the needle? I'm skeptical. Actually, so was the writer of this essay that was charting this question. I found the very end of the piece really unsatisfying, because essentially what it said is, look, things have changed. We can't move backwards. We're just going to kind of have to get used to connecting each other through Facebook and online and not really being part of communities much. And, humans evolve, we'll be okay. I, again, was not convinced. But there's this interesting moment in this piece where one of the people who did that Harvard study that I just mentioned said something that I found kind of revealing. They spoke of a place for religion that seems significant in this whole thing. This Harvard professor said, "I worry about the decline in religious affiliation and religious participation. I'm not suggesting that we should become more religious," he tries to make clear. Don't worry, I'm not saying we need to become more religious, but then he says, but if you look at it, it's in the church that people are formed morally, and the church connects people. And so there's kind of a problem that we don't have as much of an emphasis. And so he again says, I'm not saying that we should become more religious, but I feel urgently like we have to figure out how to reproduce those aspects of religion in secular life, which I thought was especially interesting. We're going to figure out how to reproduce the aspects of religion, but do it in a secular way, as if the religion part is just kind of like this husk that can get removed, and we just need the juicy bits of connection that can happen even apart from it. Is that how it works? Well, if you were with us last week studying Romans, you'll know that Romans gives a decidedly different answer and says, no, that is not possible. because connection, because genuine community is necessarily involving the religious part, or more precisely, that community only comes through connection with Jesus. The true, deep community comes because in Jesus, what happens is as we connect ourselves to Him, He connects us to a web of relationship and enables us to love within that. And yet He does it in a way where we don't suddenly lose ourselves within the community, which is always the danger of community, because it is Him that we serve. He, the one who sees us and knows us, and in whose service is perfect freedom. What we have seen is the pathway to that community that we are longing for, to the antidote to loneliness, comes through Jesus. And this morning, I want to kind of move us a little further along and see what that community looks like, because that's what Romans 12 does. What Romans 12 does is it invites us to not settle for a pseudo-community, but instead, it offers us a real community. Perhaps we can just make the distinction by saying, rather than it being a community of niceness, what Romans 12 calls us to is a community of genuine love. And I want us to see that difference this morning, and then also see why it is only through Jesus that we can experience that community of genuine love. So first, let's think about this distinction that I'm making between a community of niceness and a community of genuine love. I invite you to open your bulletins. We're going to be looking at that last paragraph. The first paragraph is for context, but we're going to be just kind of working through verses 9 through 13 and seeing what it says. And you'll notice how it begins. Verse 9, let love be genuine. This, I would suggest, is the thesis statement. This is the core that everything else is kind of developing beyond that. Let love be genuine. And the very statement that Paul makes here implies that there is maybe a version of love, or at least an appearance of love, that's not genuine. Again, we might make the distinction between a genuine love and something that kind of looks like love but isn't really, that is, being nice. So what's this distinction? How do we make a difference between a community of genuine love and a community of niceness? Well, let me kind of give 4 contrasts that I think we see in our passage. First, a community of niceness seeks to be pleasant, whereas a community of genuine love seeks what is truly good for the person. So we see that very idea right after. After let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. See, with niceness, we want the other person to feel good, right? Like if we're trying to be nice, we want everything to be pleasant. We want to make the person be happy that they're with us, because we then know that we are liked and we want to be liked. Niceness means pleasantness. The problem is sometimes the truly loving thing is not the pleasant thing. So I don't know if, I haven't watched talent shows for many years, but there used to be a time with American Idol where the very first episode was by far the most painful, because you would see all of the different kind of auditions throughout the country, and inevitably, because they were cruel to you, they would show you some of the absolutely worst singing examples that I can even imagine. I mean, I don't know if you're like this, but I have a strong cringe reflex when I'm watching something embarrassing, and I had to do this. Like, I could not watch. And while I'm watching people who sing without any rhythm, without any tone, without anything, I'm asking myself a basic question: where were their friends? Right? Because you know they have to have someone who heard them singing, who, if they had just been kind, would have sat them down and says, I love you, brother, or I love you, sister, but this is just not your thing. But we know why that didn't happen, right? Because, man, that's a hard conversation to have. You might even offend the person if you do that. You know the easier thing, the nicer thing to do, is when they just belt out that song without any tune whatsoever, say, man, that was great. You're really good at this. Both people feel happy in the end, and it's nice. But niceness isn't the same thing as love, is it? Love is seeking the genuine good of the other, and that clearly is not what was going on. To use an example maybe that's closer to home, imagine you know of someone in the community who posts something on social media it's not wise. Maybe they are saying something that is very critical of one of their parents in a way it's unkind. Or maybe they're posting some really exaggerated political claim that you realize that's just not being very careful with the truth. Within social media, there is usually, within at least your tribe, kind of a rule of niceness. What do you do when one of your friends within the tribe of social media says something? You validate them. You give them a like. You say something that kind of reinforces, because that's the nice thing to do. Of course, there's sometimes something that's very different in social media. Some people just are trolls, and they just want to say something that's mean, and they're not doing anything loving by disagreeing. They're just trying to score points. Neither of those is what is genuine love, is it? What is genuine love within a community like that? It's not just validating. Genuine love means finding that person sometime and face-to-face talking with them and saying, hey, I saw that post. Tell me more about that. Because we're first seeking to understand because we want the pathway of gentleness. And then at some point, we probably say something like, hey, I'm sure you didn't mean it this way, but this probably wasn't the best way to do that. Is that harder than doing a thumbs up on Facebook? Absolutely. Is it awkward? Probably. And you might find that the person you're talking with doesn't like you very much after that, at least immediately. But you're seeking the good of the other person. That's what genuine love looks like. Genuine love is not about being pleasant. That's niceness. It's about seeking the genuine good of the person. Secondly, whereas niceness is generally shallow, genuine love goes deep. So within a community of niceness, there's kind of some rules that everyone understands, even though we never actually say it. Like, hey, how you doing? We know that the answer is not supposed to be a 30-minute tirade of how difficult one's life is. No, you're supposed to say, doing great, how about you? And if at any point someone talks about their difficulty, if I respond in the community of niceness and say, just let me know whatever I can do to help, that means something that's fairly painless, like if you need to borrow my lawnmower, or maybe if I'm really kind, I can give you a ride. But it only goes that far and no further, because in a community of niceness, there's not really much depth. But we see something different here, right? When we see what Paul is describing, what Christ's community looks like. Love one another with brotherly affection. That is, love one another at an emotional level that expresses the bond that you actually have with each other. Some of you know I have 3 younger brothers, and we're scattered across the country, but at any point if they text, say, hey, can we talk, I would try to figure out how to organize my schedule to talk to him, because they're my brothers. And if they need something, even if it's more than borrowing a lawnmower, if it's something significant, I will seek to do it because of the bond that exists between us. And when we're being told to love one another with a brotherly affection, we're being told, look, you need to understand, you're family. You and I have a bond that we only are beginning to understand how deep it is. We have one Lord, we have one faith, we have one baptism, we have one hope. We have eternity before us where you and I will be spending it together. The bond that we have is extraordinary. And Paul is saying, and you need to learn to live into that. It goes deep. You know, I think one of the most delightful things, and I know I'm going to say something that does not seem delightful to those of you who are introverts, but that time during the service where we get up and say hello to each other, and maybe even for those who, unlike me, are not from New England, give each other a hug, there is something about that that actually expresses something deep. We have bonds that are deeper than family, and this is just a way of expressing that. See, genuine love goes deep, whereas niceness is only shallow. Also, niceness seeks to be noticed, whereas genuine love notices. I mean, that is kind of what's going on with niceness, right? Like, I know when I'm being nice, a lot of times I want to come off as a good guy. I want you to notice, hey, this is a nice guy. But that's different from genuine love, isn't it? Again, if we continue with our passage, what does it say next? Outdo one another in showing honor. In other words, rather than trying to be seen honorable, the energy is spent on trying to help the other person be seen. So if niceness is about being noticed, genuine love notices and pays attention to the other. So genuine love is focused on the other person and admires the person and is quick to notice and even compliment the other person. Genuine love in a conversation, rather than turning the conversation always towards them and the story they have to tell, is curious and asking questions and wanting to pay attention more to the other. Genuine love, rather than in a conversation where there's disagreements, trying to make sure they are understood, first and foremost is trying to understand. Because whereas niceness seeks to be noticed, genuine love notices. And the fourth contrast I want to suggest that we see here is whereas niceness is cheap, genuine love is costly. I mean, there's a reason why I think we will find communities more frequently that are communities of niceness than communities of genuine love. Because niceness just feels way more sustainable. It just doesn't demand much of us, right? But if you're thinking at all about what we've just talked about in the contrast, that is clearly not the way it is for genuine love. And Paul is very realistic about this. When you skip down to verse 13, what does it say? Contribute to the needs of the saints. Literally, and the saints, of course, here is just talking about the body of Christ, talking about fellow Christians, talking about the church. Literally, it's share in the needs. That is, when someone within the church experience a need, what we are meant to do is all of us feel the weight of it together. Paul says in Galatians 6 that we're meant to carry each other's burdens. In other words, when one person feels a burden and they're kind of carrying it on their back, everyone else comes around and puts their shoulder under it too, and so collectively they feel the weight. That's the idea, to share in the needs of each other, which when we begin to think about it, is costly. There might be some in the congregation who are experiencing times of financial need, perhaps because of unemployment or an unexpected expense. When we help carry the weight of that, that means we are at work, perhaps trying to help them to find a job, or maybe loaning a car, or doing what we can to help out. There are many in our congregation who might be experiencing an emotional burden, whether that's grief or depression or loneliness. When we share in that need, when we help carry that burden, that means not us trying to fix that, but patiently and quietly walking with people in the middle of it, and sometimes being willing to sit in awkwardness because we're just in it together. We all, in different ways, are carrying spiritual burdens where we are still battling against sinful tendencies as we're seeking to grow in Christ, and carrying the weight of that means us trying to encourage each other and being patient with each other and praying for each other. We are sharing in the needs of each other, and that's costly. It takes energy. I mean, this is why, backing up a couple of verses, in verse 11, Paul says, don't be slothful in zeal, be fervent in spirit. He's saying you're going to have to kind of pay attention. This is going to, what I'm calling you to is going to demand something of you, and it will take energy. It will take passion. It is draining to have uncomfortable conversations with others because you seek their good. It takes real effort at times to pay attention to the other as they're telling their story, even though at first it just doesn't seem at all interesting to you, but you're trying to pay attention to them. It can be exhausting to help carry one another's burdens. It costs. Niceness is cheap. Genuine love is costly. But having said that, isn't that the community that you want to be a part of? What good is a community that you know on the surface seems all pleasant, but the moment something gets hard, or the moment you make a mistake, you will find no one there for you? What good is a community that only goes skin deep and is not willing to do the hard things to help care for you when you need to be corrected or you need someone to walk with you? And more than that, don't you also want to be the kind of person who is not just nice, but who actually loves, even though it's costly? I'm reminded of a point C.S. Lewis made about the safety of not loving. He wrote, "To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping your heart intact, you must give it to no one. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable." Isn't that as scary and as costly as it feels what we want? The only antidote to loneliness is not a nice community. It is being one who loves in the context of a genuinely loving community. But how do we do that? How do we get there? I know this much, that some sort of ad campaign, no matter how glitzy, no matter how attractive the people in the commercial are, who are just showing how much they love each other, and like that final tagline with some beautiful music, "Let's love together," that's not going to do it. Like, I know my own heart, and I know that's not going to be enough to kind of move me out of my innate self-absorption and self-protection. We need something far more powerful than education or promotion or marketing to move us to the kind of community that we long for. And what we see in our passage is that the only way that I know of that gets us to that kind of community is through our connection to Jesus. That He and He alone has the power to bring about what we truly need here. Why do I say that? How do these two connect? Well, I think we also see that in our passage. 3 different things I think we notice about how connecting to Jesus makes this kind of community possible. So, when you get to verse 11, we just mentioned before this call to be not slothful in zeal, but to be fervent in spirit. And perhaps when we're hearing that, it's like, I don't got that in me. How do I do that? But notice what happens right after. He says, serve the Lord. And the Lord here, because just the way that Paul uses the word Lord in Romans, is almost certainly talking about serving Jesus. And here's why this is, I think, just extraordinarily important. Let's just kind of be honest about this for a moment. More often than not, or at least oftentimes, the hardest but the truest kind of versions of love that we will have to express often involve us loving people who aren't that easy to love in the moment. Right? That's when love really experiences its tests, when someone is in a dark place and so they're just unpleasant and they are ungrateful and they are difficult to love. And honestly, they don't seem deserving. You have to love kind of beyond what they deserve in that moment. And if we're honest, if we're just looking at the person we're seeking to love, it doesn't seem worth it. But Jesus is worth it. Like, you can never love Jesus more than He deserves. And the reason Paul says this here right in the middle of this is to let you know that whoever you're serving, however difficult it is serving, when you are part of the body of Christ and you're serving another member, the person you are also serving is Jesus. When you are having that awkward conversation with someone, or when you're cooking a meal for someone who is sick, or when you're spending hours on Saturday night preparing for a Sunday school class and you know that it's going to be an energetic group of kids, what you are doing above anything else is serving and showing love to Jesus. All the tiredness you experience, all the time that you spend, all the tears that you cry as you're seeking to love others, in the end, when we see them rightly, we recognize these are gifts that we are offering up first and foremost to our Savior. And the beautiful thing is that he sees every single offering that we offer, and it is precious to him, and it pleases him. And if you can begin to see that, that will make a change in your heart and open you up to a kind of love that you did not experience think was possible before. Do you see how that works? We see more here in the next verse. We see again Paul's realism when he talks about being patient in tribulation. He is honest that the kind of love that a community of genuine love is supposed to express involves being long-suffering in the face of difficulty. How do we do that? Well, notice what it's paired with. Rejoice in hope. As we come to Christ, what we are meant to understand is that this person who sees us when we are seeking to serve him and loves us is also the King of the universe who will reward us. He is the one who promises that in the end, he will make all things right, and there is nothing that we will do in service to him that in any way will seem vain, that will seem that it was not worth it. As Paul reminds us, this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Honestly, I don't know exactly what he's talking about when he talks about this eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, but I suspect when I see it, it will be awesome. And here's why this is important. Because in the moment when you are seeking to live in this way of genuine love, if you draw up a spreadsheet where you kind of like, for the moment, say all of the things that you're gaining from loving like this and all of the things that it's costing, if you're just looking at right now, it is not going to add up in the favor of love. But if you're able to see this from the perspective of eternity, then there is no comparison. You know, there are so many things that we are willing to do, difficult things that we're willing to endure because of what lies at the end. Entrepreneurs are willing to spend days upon days, extended hours just to kind of build a business, and they work themselves to death almost. Marathoners, strangely, are willing to go through deep amounts of difficulty just to get to the finish line. A mother is willing to endure the worst pains in labor so that her child might be born. And at the end, we know we are willing to do it because at the end, it's worth it. And what Jesus promises us is there is not a thing that we will do, not a tear that we will cry. There is nothing that we will do being done in his name that at the end we'll go, why did I do that? It will be glory. And if we can see that, that gives us the capacity to, even as we are sacrificing, to rejoice. Because we're able to see the present moment in the context of a confident hope because of Jesus. And so we can love. Do you see how that works? Or one final thing we also see in verse 12, this final comment in this context of how to do this. He says, be constant in prayer. Prayer, of course, is it's not just about being quiet. It's not just meditating. It's not a ritual. Prayer is the privilege that is given to us because we belong to Jesus, where we can turn towards our personal God and ask him for help. And when we learn to do that, not just as an occasional thing whenever we're especially desperate, but as it says here, being constant, when we learn to allow that to become just a part of our lives where it's integrated into who we are and how we live, a funny thing happens. As we are constant in prayer, we find ourselves growing in love. Why is that? Well, to begin with, oftentimes when we find love is difficult, one of the things we'll do is like, God, please help me to love, because I really don't feel it right now. And God answers prayer. But perhaps more subtly, there's an aspect of when we keep on turning ourselves towards God in dependence upon Him, that we come to know Him more. And the more we come to know God, who He is, the more we become like Him. And what we discover is that God is love. The more we come to gaze upon God as we turn to Him in prayer, the more we find that He loves us with a breathtaking love. Whereas attention is so perfectly upon us that He knows our every thought, not a hair can fall from our head apart from His will. Where He is earnestly, lovingly seeking our good, and He knows what our good is. Where His love for us goes deeper than even a father for a son, and He is willing to go to extreme costs to bring about our good, even the death of His very Son. He is a God who loves us beyond what we can imagine, and the more we come to see that, the more we find our hearts becoming like Him, and our hearts growing in love. And we start also realizing that the same God who loves us like this loves every single one of us like this. And we find ourselves joining in with God, seeking to love others as He loves. As we're constant in prayer, as we're dependent upon Him, as we're turning towards Him, our hearts grow because of what Jesus has done to allow this to happen. Do you see how that works? See, there is, I would suggest, an antidote to this epidemic of loneliness. There is a pathway to genuine community, the community that we long for, the community that we need, but it is not through massive educational or awareness campaigns. It is quite simply through the person of Jesus. Through learning that all of our love is service to Him, to seeing the present in the perspective of what He promises in the future and rejoicing in hope, through Him turning to God our Father in prayer and becoming like Him. And right now, I'd invite us to even take that next step, to turn to our God in prayer, to name honestly before our God where we feel our own failings. As we hear this call towards a kind of love, we're probably exposed to our own selfishness. It is good for us to name that to God, to confess it. He's not surprised, and He forgives. And when we name it to Him, He is willing to work on it and change us. So let's call out to our God, both for forgiveness and help. And I'll lead us after a couple minutes of silent prayer and prayer together. Would you please join with me in prayer?